Picture this. You're setting out on the Oregon Trail, a 2,000-mile trek where 1 in 10 travelers died, most from disease like cholera, not from gunfights or wagon crashes. The wagons have no suspension, so every rock and pothole rattles your bones. Roads are more like muddy trenches or dusty ruts, and the nearest help is usually miles away. Before we get into the details, take a moment to get comfortable. Maybe turn on a fan, or let some soft background noise fill the room. Let's ease into tonight's journey together as we explore the deadly realities of frontier travel, where every mile was a gamble with death. But even before you reach the first mile marker, the stench in the air will remind you this wasn't a comfortable journey.
What really set frontier life apart was the constant battle with filth. The stench wasn't just unpleasant, it was overwhelming. A thick layer that coated every surface and hung in the air. For most settlers, bathing was a rare event, maybe once a month if water allowed. And even then, it was more about necessity than comfort. Clean water was precious, saved for drinking and cooking, so washing up took a back seat. With no indoor plumbing or running taps, cleaning yourself or your clothes was a hassle most people simply endured. The result was a mix of sweat, grime, and dust that never quite left you. The towns themselves were just as rough. Plumbing didn't exist, so waste, both human and animal, ended up in open drains, ditches, or straight onto the streets. Horse manure piled up everywhere, especially in busy areas. In some places, it could reach knee-deep, mixing with garbage and forming a thick, foul paste whenever it rained. When things dried out, the wind would whip up clouds of dust and dried manure, making every breath gritty. No sanitation crews came by to tidy up. Instead, the mess just accumulated, attracting flies and other insects that thrived in the filth. Disease was everywhere. Without any real understanding of germs, people blamed bad air or unlucky circumstances for illness. Cholera, typhoid, diphtheria, and tuberculosis were constant threats, spreading quickly through contaminated water and food. Outbreaks swept through entire families and towns, often with little warning. Cuts and scrapes, which today would be minor annoyances, could easily turn deadly in this environment. Without antibiotics or even basic first aid, infections spread fast. Life expectancy was short, and much of that was thanks to the sheer lack of sanitation. People did what they could to cope. Some tried to mask the smell with scented handkerchiefs or a splash of perfume. Most just got used to it, letting the stink become part of the background noise of daily life. But there was no escaping the toll it took. Living in these conditions meant constant risk. Your health was always on the line, and the smallest wound could become a real threat. Modern life, by comparison, is almost unimaginable. Running water and regular trash pickup mean you can start your day clean, with fresh air and little thought about what's lurking underfoot. But in the Wild West, comfort was rare, and luxury even rarer. And if you think the air was bad, wait until you see what passed for clothing and food.
Clothing on the frontier was its own kind of trial. You might own 2 outfits at most. One for daily labor, one for those rare occasions when you needed to look your best. Both would be made from rough canvas or stiff denim that never seemed to soften, no matter how many times you wore them. Shirts rubbed against sunburned skin and left you itching. For women, it was even worse. Layers of petticoats, corsets, stockings, and long dresses, all dragging in the dust and picking up fleas, no matter the season. These clothes were rough, stiff, and seldom washed, clinging to your skin all day. Comfort wasn't part of the equation.
Laundry day meant hauling everything to a creek and beating the dirt out with rocks in freezing water, if you even had time for that. Food was just as unforgiving. Most days started and ended with beans, biscuits if you had flour, and maybe a cup of coffee so strong it tasted like burnt wood. Fresh fruit and vegetables were fleeting. If you saw them at all, it was only in the short window of summer. By winter, your meals were salt pork, hardtack that could crack a tooth, and whatever dried food you managed to stash away. The lack of variety led to real health problems. Scurvy, caused by not getting enough vitamin C, left people with bleeding gums, aching joints, and loose teeth. Children's teeth would loosen, and adults suffered constant pain. Malnutrition was a fact of life, and the stomach aches from spoiled or undercooked food were just part of the daily routine. Preserving food took up entire days. Women boiled berries into jam or dried what little produce they could find, hoping it would last until spring. Men hunted when they could, but game wasn't guaranteed, and a bad season meant everyone felt it. Meat had to be eaten right away or preserved with salt or smoke, which changed the taste and stripped away most of the nutrition. Sometimes you'd eat watery gruel flavored by a single strip of bacon, just to stretch supplies. Mealtime was about survival, not enjoyment. Poor storage meant that foodborne illnesses like dysentery were common, and sometimes just as deadly as any gunfight. Today it's easy to take soft fabrics and a stocked fridge for granted, but back then, every choice, what to wear, what to eat, was shaped by scarcity and risk. And as tough as life was inside your home or wagon, the world outside brought its own set of dangers, waiting for you the moment you stepped out the door.
Everyday routines on the frontier were shaped by risk. Before you even thought about putting on your boots, you'd shake them out every single morning. Settlers learned this ritual the hard way after too many painful encounters with scorpions hiding inside. The sting could leave you feverish and vomiting, and the nearest help was often hours away by horse. Snakes also made themselves at home under beds and porches drawn by warmth. One careless step could mean a venomous bite, and you'd have a long, desperate ride for help, if there was any to be found at all. Vigilance wasn't optional. It was a matter of survival. Then there was the weather, which seemed to have a mind of its own. You might wake to clear skies, and by noon, watch as flash floods washed away trails and camps. Blizzards could roll in without warning, trapping travelers and freezing them in place. Frontier winters were especially harsh. Inside a sod house or a drafty log cabin, the temperature could drop below freezing, and when snow blocked supply routes, people sometimes ran out of food and fuel. In summer, droughts dried up creeks and turned fields to dust. Tornadoes didn't bother with warnings. They could tear through a settlement in minutes, leaving nothing but debris behind. With no way to predict the weather, every day was a gamble, and even solid shelter offered little real protection. Wildlife brought its own set of problems. Sod houses and log cabins kept out the wind, but not always the animals. Bears could break down doors looking for food, wolves circled livestock at night, and cougars watched from the tree line, waiting for someone to stray too far from safety. Even inside, you weren't entirely secure. If you traveled between settlements, you never went unarmed. A broken wagon wheel miles from the nearest town left you exposed, and predators, animal or otherwise, rarely passed up an easy target. So people adapted. They made checking boots and inspecting firewood part of the daily rhythm, always alert for whatever might be lurking nearby. The rituals of survival never stopped. You learn to listen for the wrong kind of silence, to watch the horizon for trouble, and to keep your guard up, even when things seemed calm. But sometimes it wasn't the wilderness or the weather that posed the greatest threat. Sometimes the real danger came from the people around you.
Step into a saloon. Not the polished kind from the movies, but a rough wooden room, crowded with tired faces and the heavy smell of sweat and spilled liquor. The whiskey here is raw, sometimes mixed with tobacco juice or even turpentine, burning all the way down. A few sips are enough to make your eyes water. Before long, voices rise. A card game sours over a few dollars and tempers snap. Someone reaches for a revolver. Shots go off. Not in any neat, choreographed duel, but in a messy, impulsive scramble. Most people hit by stray bullets aren't even part of the fight. The violence isn't dramatic. It's sudden, clumsy, and fueled by cheap alcohol and bad luck. Law enforcement barely kept up. Sheriffs were responsible for vast territories, sometimes spanning thousands of square miles. Most towns saw a lawman only when things got truly out of hand. If trouble started, it was up to regular folks to act. Vigilante groups formed quickly, and lynch mobs often executed suspects on the spot, with little care for guilt or innocence. Trials, if they happened at all, were short and rarely fair. The idea of innocent until proven guilty didn't hold up when the main goal was to restore order fast. Most violence wasn't the stuff of legends. Bar fights led to broken noses and bloodied floors. Domestic disputes sometimes turned deadly, hidden behind thin cabin walls. Petty theft could spiral fast, especially if someone got caught stealing a horse, an offense likely to end in hanging. Punishments were severe. Prisons were rare and miserable, with disease and violence killing more inmates than the sentences themselves. Communities leaned toward swift justice. A rope was cheaper than a jail cell, and nobody wanted the risk of an escape. You carried a gun because you had to, not because it made you feel tough. Arguments over land or livestock could end with a quick, private duel. No police, no paperwork, just one more grave out by the fence line. Even children learned to keep their distance from strangers, and everyone watched their backs, because desperation could push anyone over the edge. If you survived the saloon, the street, and your neighbors, there was still another danger waiting. Out here, even a small injury could turn into a real threat. If people didn't die in the saloon, frontier medicine might finish the job.
Medical care on the frontier was a gamble, and most folks knew it. Doctors in the Wild West often had little formal training, sometimes just a brief apprenticeship or a few months at a medical college, if that. If you cut your hand chopping wood, what started as a minor wound could quickly spiral out of control. The town doctor might reach for his bloodletting kit, hoping to rebalance your humors. His instruments weren't sterilized. At best, he'd wipe them on his sleeve. If you were lucky, he'd pour some whiskey on the wound first, but infection was almost guaranteed. The phrase, something as simple as an infected cut could lead to amputation or death, wasn't just a warning. It was a daily reality. Surgery happened wherever there was space, often right on your kitchen table. Anesthesia meant a bottle of whiskey, or, if you were fortunate, a bit of morphine.
Broken bones were pulled straight by hand while you bit down on a leather strap. The doctor's medicine chest was full of things that could kill you faster than the illness. Mercury for syphilis, arsenic for fevers, and opium when the pain got too much. None of it was backed by much science. Germ theory hadn't reached most of the West, so surgeons moved from patient to patient, wiping their knives on whatever was handy and never thinking twice about it. Childbirth was especially dangerous. Out on the frontier, women faced odds that seem unthinkable now. Maternal mortality hovered around 1 in 100 births, but in some remote areas, it could spike to as high as 1 in 4. Midwives carried sharp hooks for emergencies, and many women wrote their wills before labor began. There was no prenatal care, no pain relief except maybe a swig of liquor, and no guarantee you'd survive to see your child. Work in the mines brought its own hazards. With no safety regulations, a cave-in or explosion could leave you crushed and alone. If you survived, infection usually followed. There was no disability pay. Losing a limb meant begging in the street or relying on charity, if you were lucky. Chronic pain and disability were just part of life for many. With doctors in short supply and their treatments often worse than the problem, people turned to home remedies. Some packed wounds with cow manure, hoping it would draw out infection. Sometimes it worked, but more often it just made things worse. Toothaches? Those got solved with pliers and a steady hand. No anesthetic, just grit and maybe a stiff drink. Infections didn't wait for you to rest. If you were trying to cross a river or slog through mud, a small cut could become deadly before you reached the next camp. Out here, every journey carried its own risks, and sometimes the road itself was the most dangerous part of all.
Travel on the frontier was a test of endurance and luck. Picture yourself wedged into a wagon, the wheels grinding through endless ruts, every jolt rattling your bones. This wasn't a road trip. It was the Oregon Trail, a 2,000-mile gauntlet of mud, steep climbs, and river crossings. The trail earned its reputation as the nation's longest graveyard, with an estimated 10 to 15 deaths for every mile. Graves lined the path, some marked with rough wooden crosses, many with nothing at all. Disease was the biggest killer, and it spread fast. Cholera especially ran rampant through contaminated water. Travelers tried to boil what they drank, but with no way to filter out the bacteria, it didn't do much good. You could be healthy at breakfast and buried by sundown. Families sometimes lost several members in a single week. Dysentery and typhoid swept through camps, leaving people too weak to move on. Children were hit hardest, their bodies unable to fight back. There were no hospitals, no doctors waiting at the next stop. If you got sick, you rode it out in the back of a wagon, hoping for the best. Rivers were another constant threat. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake all looked calm until you tried to cross. Wagons weren't built to float, so families had to partially dismantle them and lash the pieces together, hoping to make it to the other side. Many didn't. Supplies and livestock were lost to the current, and sometimes people vanished beneath the water. Contrary to the old stories, native tribes along the trail often stepped in to help. They brought supplies, offered advice, and sometimes guided travelers across the most dangerous crossings. Far from being the enemy, they were more likely to save your life than threaten it. Travel wasn't just dangerous over long distances. Even a day's ride to a nearby settlement could turn deadly. A thrown horse, a snake bite, or a sudden flash flood could end it all. Blizzards trapped people without warning. Navigation was mostly guesswork. Maps were wrong, guides unreliable, and landmarks could change or disappear. Getting lost meant hunger, dehydration, and sometimes death. The psychological toll was just as severe. Imagine having to bury a child or spouse by the trail at dawn, then climbing back into the wagon and moving on by noon. There was no time to grieve. People broke under the strain, sometimes refusing to go any farther or wandering away from the group, never to be seen again. The weight of loss and exhaustion pressed down on every mile, and when the trail finally ended, the hardships didn't. The promise of a new life came with more hard work, more hunger, and no guarantee of safety. But for many, the hardest part wasn't the miles or the danger. It was the silence that followed, the days and weeks spent cut off from the world with only the emptiness for company. Isolation on the frontier wasn't just an inconvenience. It shaped every part of daily life. You might go days without seeing another person, especially if your nearest neighbor lived miles away across rough ground. Letters sometimes took months to arrive, or never did at all. So any news from home was always old news. For many, the only voice they heard for weeks was their own echo in a cramped log cabin. The loneliness seeped into everything, and it didn't take long before it started to wear people down. People called it prairie madness. It was more than just feeling lonely. The miles between settlements, the endless work, and the relentless quiet drove some settlers into deep depression, anxiety, or even psychosis. Diaries from the time describe women staring at the same four walls, desperate for conversation. Some left their homes behind, wandering into the plains without a word. Others lashed out at those closest to them. There are stories of mothers harming their children, or husbands snapping after months in isolation. The psychological strain of frontier life left scars that didn't always show. Communication crawled along at the speed of a tired horse. You might wait all winter for a letter, only to find it torn and water-stained when it finally arrived. News of a family death could reach you long after the funeral. People clung to old letters, reading them until the ink faded. When someone did pass through, maybe a traveling preacher or a peddler, they were pressed for every bit of news, every scrap of gossip. Social interaction was rare and precious. Visiting a neighbor meant a long walk or ride, and most days, there just wasn't time to spare. The main social events were church services, where even the least religious settlers showed up for the chance at a handshake or a shared hymn. Community hymn singing wasn't just about worship. It was a way to remind yourself you weren't completely alone. For many, those gatherings were the only break from the monotony. The work never stopped, and that made things harder. Men spent long days tending livestock or fixing fences with only the wind for company. Women cooked, cleaned, and cared for children, sometimes for weeks without adult conversation. The lack of regular social life made it easy to lose track of time. People wrote the wrong date in diaries, forgot holidays, or lost count of the seasons. Limited conversation and little access to books meant that literacy often suffered, especially for children growing up far from schools or libraries. People found ways to cope. Some families invented nightly rituals, telling stories, singing, or reading aloud to break up the silence. Women sometimes traded preserves or small goods just for a few minutes of talk. Diversity in the West was real, but so was inequality. The people who built the frontier came from all over: Chinese immigrants, Mexican families, black cowboys, European settlers, and Native Americans whose roots went back millennia. But the reality was that most of these groups faced barriers, violence, and laws designed to keep them on the margins. Chinese laborers did the back-breaking work of laying railroad tracks across mountains and deserts, often for half the pay of white workers. When the railroads were finished, many Chinese were pushed into mining, the most dangerous jobs, with the worst pay. Anti-Chinese sentiment ran high. The Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 made it illegal for Chinese workers to immigrate, the first time U.S. law banned a group based on race. Chinese communities faced riots, expulsions, and discriminatory taxes, and towns posted signs warning them away, even as they relied on their labor. Mexican families who had lived in the Southwest for generations saw their land titles overturned in U.S. courts. English common law replaced the Spanish water rights systems, and legal tricks, or outright fraud, stripped Mexican landowners of property that had been in their families for centuries. Many were pushed into low-wage work or forced to move. Even as their building styles and irrigation shaped the region, Spanish speakers found themselves in separate schools and limited to certain jobs. Black cowboys made up about 1 in 4 riders on cattle drives. They broke horses, fought off rustlers, and moved herds north, but they were often paid less and slept apart from white cowboys. Their stories rarely made it into the popular tales of the West. In some towns, black settlers built thriving communities, but success brought its own risks. White farmers sometimes pressured railroads to bypass black towns, cutting them off from trade and opportunity. Native Americans suffered the most. Treaties were signed and broken. Whenever gold or good land was found, families were forced onto reservations with poor soil and few resources. Children were taken to boarding schools where their hair was cut and their languages forbidden, a deliberate attempt to erase their culture. The buffalo, central to Plains tribe survival, was slaughtered in staggering numbers, sometimes just to drive people off the land. Women's lives were full of hard work and little legal power. Married women couldn't own property, and their wages belonged to their husbands. Single women had slightly more independence, but social judgment was harsh. Frontier women ran farms, defended homes, and did whatever was needed, but their rights remained limited. Even among white settlers, the odds weren't always fair. Small ranchers, miners, and homesteaders were often pushed aside by corporations with money and political pull. As the West grew, big business and government shaped the land more than any lone pioneer. Today, things have changed. Married women can own property. Laws protect against racial discrimination. Native tribes have some legal recourse, but equality is still a work in progress. The Wild West was never a level playing field, and the struggle for fairness didn't end when the frontier closed. All of this made daily survival even harder. For most people, life out west wasn't about chasing dreams. It was about making it through one more day. Looking back, the West was a place where comfort was rare and safety wasn't guaranteed. The average lifespan hovered around 35 years, mostly because so many children didn't survive. If you made it to adulthood and avoided disease or disaster, you might see your 50s. But every day meant another risk: cholera, violence, hunger, or just a simple accident turning deadly. Your biggest worry today might be a slow Wi-Fi signal. It's easy to forget how much has changed: clean water, electricity, doctors who understand germs. Tonight, as you settle in, take a moment to appreciate the quiet safety around you. Let me know in the comments which frontier challenge surprised you most and where you're listening from. Imagine the night sky over the prairie, clear, silent, and endless. Sleep well.